And good morning. Hope you are doing well. Cheers. This morning, I would like to cover gitignore, which is an important file that is part of the Git local repository and source code control ecosystem. And this should be pretty quick. So let me just do a few quick slides. So what is gitignore? It's simply a file. It's just a file named .gitignore. And here's the formal explanation. A gitignore file specifies intentionally untracked files that Git should ignore. Self-explanatory. Files already tracked by Git are not affected, and that is an important point. The reason that's important is because if you forget, as I've learned, imagine that if you forget to create your gitignore and you start submitting stuff or staging and committing and syncing stuff to your repository, and then you realize, oops, I should have had a gitignore file and excluded a bunch of files. It is a bit messy to try and remove files from your remote Git repository. You can subsequently exclude them, I believe, from your further commits and in your local repository. But once it got uploaded to your local repo, it's a little messy to remove it. So it is best to remember to create a gitignore file right away. It's like one of the first things you do when you create your remote repo and clone it locally. Just create your gitignore. Now, I asked if there is some mechanism to just automatically create a default gitignore, since that is what I'm used to from the .NET Framework Visual Studio world, where I say I want to create a C# .NET Framework project for WinForms, and it just creates a default .gitignore. Now, as I mentioned last episode, there are some caveats to relying upon a default gitignore, but AL seems pretty simple, so I think it's possible. But as far as I can tell, there is no automatic way to do that. That would typically be done as part of the initialization of the repo when you create it, say on your remote repo, Azure DevOps, GitHub, whatever. But that requires language recognition and creating the default file, and it's just not practical. So here is what a Visual Studio Code AL gitignore example might look like. And this is one that I created after taking I believe it was from the class I took with Waldo, Eric Waters, his Azure DevOps class. And as part of that, he happened to cover Git and how that works in Azure DevOps. So we just discussed this as part of that. And so here you see I'm excluding star.app, .vscode launch JSON, .vscode rad JSON, AL cache files, JSON files, and then zip. I don't quite recall why the zip is there. Then .g.xlf, and I believe those are the translation files. So I don't know if this is a good gitignore file, if it has too much, too little, if it should be modified. I don't know. That's just the one I've been using so far. Now, I did ask on Twitter for people to share their gitignore files, and two people responded with theirs. Danis, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Danis Floor looks like he is set up on mobile and was able to pull up Azure DevOps on a mobile device and just take a screenshot and send it on Twitter, which is pretty cool. And so his it's kind of nice. He's got comments in there. That's a good idea. So you have excluding binary files, which is AL packages and star.app, then temp files, because VS Code creates a fair number of temp files, excluding the rad.json, launch.json, which is often a machine or environment specific thing, then AL cache, AL templates, snapshots, and other items down below. And he also has the g.xlf. And then Camille responded with his. His is interesting. It takes a different approach using, he's got the star.app, but then he's got the double asterisk. And I had to look that up. What that does is it says if you find like double asterisk launch.json, if you find launch.json in any directory or subdirectory within your project, then exclude it. So you don't have to have a relative path or any path for that matter to exclude that file. It'll exclude it no matter where it is in your project structure. And he does that for several of the items. And he explained that he always uses what's called a multi-root workspace. And that is a Visual Studio Code project, I'll call it, or workspace, I guess is the formal term, where you will have multiple projects. And so the example he gave, which is a great example, is he has his extension or his app, and he has his test app. So when you create an app in Business Central, you should, of course, best practice, always have a test app. And so if you're always going to have an app and a test app, then you're almost always going to have a multi-root workspace. So it makes sense. So that was his explanation for the double asterisk. So you just have one gitignore file, and it can exclude these files in your test app directories and your app directories both at the same time. So that's pretty clever. Now, he did point out that the one at the bottom there, double asterisk slash dot star, that would essentially exclude, my understanding is, any files that begin with a period in any directory. So that's pretty sweeping. So he noticed that and he said, maybe I need to reconsider that. That may be a little too aggressive. So I guess the one thing worse than not excluding a file from your Git repository is excluding too many files from your Git repository, because then you'll eventually be looking for that code and you'll regret not having checked it in. So anyway, those are some examples. So with that, let's take a look at how this works. Visual Studio Code, I think, is very interesting. It behaves differently than full Visual Studio, and I think it took a while for me to get used to. It was very weird at first coming from Visual Studio, where everything is very metadata based and you have to have everything set up in the solution and project files, and there are all these references that can break. VS Code is like, hey, if it's on your file system, I'm going to look at it. And it's that simple. It's pretty cool. It's super simple, no overhead, no metadata. So let's take a look at this. Okay, so here I have, I did this once before, and let's see if I remember how I set it up yesterday. So I'm going to launch Visual Studio Code, and I have another call coming up, so let me wrap this up. So here I have Visual Studio Code, and I am just going to press F1, and let me first turn on screencast mode. Then I'm going to press F1, and I'm going to do ALGO. And so I'm going to call this gitignore test. And this will be wave 2, and choose my server. This will be my local server. And I'm going to call this, let me just resize this here. This is my dev17 server. Server instance is BC. I do not want a startup object, so I'm just going to comment that out. And there we go. So now, and screencast randomly turns off. So now we have a basic project, right? So next, I'm going to press F1, and I am going to download symbols from my BC Docker container. Symbols have been downloaded. Now, you may have noticed that files just started appearing over on the left here in my File Explorer view. I've got the launch.json, AL packages that got downloaded as part of the symbols. I've got a snapshots folder, a VS Code folder, app.json. So it's like there's a lot going on here. So already we are able to test this. Now, when I click on the source control button over here to open the source control pane, it says, hey, you don't yet have a Git repository. So I've previously shown how you can create a remote repository and clone it locally. Well, I don't need this in Azure DevOps. I just need it local. So I can initialize locally. So let me do that. And that says, oh, okay, great. Let me manage this in Git for you. It kind of puts these files and Git starts tracking things. Now you will notice that Git has said, hey, I've already found these changes. I'm on the ball. I found your hello world. I found your AL packages file. I found your launch.json. Cool. Okay. Now, the one thing that I don't have here is I don't have a gitignore. So before I start pushing this up to my remote repository where it's going to be carved in stone, I want to have a gitignore. And that can be as simple, there's probably a better way, which I'll show you. There can be as simple as adding a new file called .gitignore. Press enter, that's it. Now, I'm going to go over here. This is a cool thing about VS Code. I'm going to go over here and show my source control pane while editing gitignore. And let me move this down. So I'm going to say, I do not want to include these .app files because these are the symbols. And these are presumably large files. They are version specific to BC. And I don't need them in my source code repository. So I'm going to do star.app. And I'm going to press Control S. And as soon as I save that file, Visual Studio Code reads that file and instantly gitignore starts working. It's like, oh, okay, I'm gonna hide those files. Pretty cool. Now, let's say, let me look at my sample gitignore. So that was that .app. Now, let's say that I also want to exclude my launch.json because that's machine specific, environment specific, developer specific. So I can do launch.json. I'm going to press save and it disappeared. Now, interestingly, it did it even though I did not specify the VS Code folder. So it's almost like, okay, that's kind of a global file I want you to always track, which is interesting. Now, if I say, oops, if I go here in my gitignore and say .vscode/launch.json, like what you see in my notepad here, then it is still excluded. Now, what if I say vscode1 launch.json and I save? All of a sudden, my launch.json pops back into the tracked pane. So into the changes pane. So it is, I don't quite understand all the permutations, but just wanted to demonstrate how this works and that you can easily see, the great thing is you can easily see what your changes in gitignore are doing for your tracked files. So let's say that I want to exclude all hello world files. There we go. So I don't even have to specify a directory. Now, if I go in here and I decide that I want all my AL files to be in a source directory, I can drag hello world there. I can move it. Now I can go back to my changes and hello star.al is still untracked. Okay. So now I can remove that. All of a sudden it starts tracking hello world AL. What else do we have? We have rad.json. So let's take a look at that. So let's do vscode/rad. Now I don't see rad.json in the changes list here. So that is interesting. If we go here, oh, what happened? So I don't know where rad.json appears. Let's try doing a build and see what happens, see if that makes it appear. And I don't have any XLF files. Next, we do have AL cache. So let me do a Control F5. Actually, let me just do an F5 without the control. Do a build and publish. Is it launching my browser? There we go. Okay. So going to log in. This is my dev17 Docker container. And so that has been built and published. And you'll notice if I go over here, I now have my app file. So Visual Studio has built my app file. It's essentially compiled it, and then it published it to my Docker container. So now I have one more file. So, okay, but because I have star.app here, it's excluded. Now, did I get any other files? No. So I'm not sure when the rad.json comes in. I'll need to look at that. And when the AL cache comes into play. Presumably there's a good reason these were there. And so, further testing, debugging, whatever, will probably create those. But that's just what I have in my gitignore. So with that, what's nice about this is the gitignore, when you set it up right away, it keeps your changes list clean. And maybe I don't even want to keep my gitignore in there. Maybe a different developer has a different gitignore file. So I'm going to add that to my gitignore. And my gitignore is going to cause Git to ignore my gitignore. Very recursive there. So anyway, a really cool feature. It's pretty simple. Now with that said, let me go grab this link. Once you get into some really fancy stuff, like all things Git, it can go from simple to extreme. This page shows you some of the syntax for gitignore. And much of it is pretty simple, but there's some things that I don't quite understand. So for instance, it talks about the user's tilde/.gitconfig. And the tilde is used a couple of times, and I think that might be a Unix abbreviation for the user directory. So there are a few things they don't fully explain, and that may be platform specific. And so you can go in here and you can see how this can get more complex depending on your needs. Now, my impression is the AL stuff is relatively simple, but if you look at some more complex application environments, development tools, it can get really complex. And Eric Hugard posted a comment here, and he says, okay, so this is a good discussion point. He says he disagrees completely on ignoring the .app unless you have a build pipeline. So, excellent point. Thank you. I forgot, this is a point of contention, and there was a Twitter thread on this a while back as to whether you should include your .app files in your Git repositories. And it depends on what your environment is, what your build practices are. So if I go in here and I have my .app file and I'm constantly building this, and I don't have a Azure DevOps pipeline that is doing this automatically and storing these app builds in a repository somewhere, then this might be the only place where I have this version of this app file. So let's say that a customer, for whatever reason, needs to roll back to version 14.6.2.1a because of some weird bug that comes up. Well, if you have no backup copies of this .app file that is this nice clean published build of that 14.3.6.2a or whatever, then you're going to have some fun trying to roll your code back or get to that checkpoint or branch or whatever, which may be very difficult to reproduce that. So I think that is one reason. And so Eric says, every build is different. There's a package. Okay. Yes, I now recall this from the Twitter thread. Every build is different. There's a package ID in the folder. So two alike builds cannot be deployed to the cloud because the package ID is different. Okay. And this, I'm not there yet, but he's saying that essentially internally, you're going to have a unique ID like a GUID, and that build is unique, and so you can't deploy multiple versions of this to the cloud. That will cause problems. So, okay. So I guess the question is if you're doing a lot of debugging and testing, and you're doing commits, you might potentially have lots of versions of this in here, and you'll just need to be careful to tag or commit and check in the sacred version. I'm not sure how you would track it then if you're doing this constantly and you have multiple developers doing debug builds and commits. So that's a whole discussion. Maybe that will be a discussion where I bring on Eric and Jeremy on a live stream. But anyway, as you can tell from the discussion, there is some nuance to gitignore. So maybe you, maybe you don't want to exclude, or you don't want to have star.app in your gitignore. Maybe you do want to check those in. I think I got this, from probably from Waldo's session where we were discussing Azure DevOps pipelines. So in that context, it may have been appropriate, but for other people, you might want to have a different gitignore. So with that, just a demonstration of how this works. There's a lot more syntax you can add to it. And as you saw from the examples, different people have different gitignore files depending on their organization's needs. But anyway, thought I'd share that with you, and hope that was helpful. And maybe I'll follow up with Jeremy and Eric to rehash the discussion on whether or not you should exclude .app files from your Git repo, and what are the scenarios on making that decision as to whether to include them in your Git repo or not. Okay, have a good day, and go break something with Git. Okay, talk to you later.